This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning.
I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
US Vice President Kamala Harris takes centre stage at the Democratic Convention as she formally accepts the nomination for president, becoming the second woman ever nominated for the presidency by a major US political party. Stocks edge lower and Japan's yen rises as investors brace for a reality check on rate cuts ahead of Jerome Powell's speech at Jackson Hole. And on our next Africa segment this week, the bitter truth. Chocolate prices are likely to stay high as Ghana says it will no longer be borrowing from international banks to fund next season's cocoa crop. It's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai, in for Jemana Basechi. Welcome to Friday. Happy Friday. You made it here. The most important day of the week, perhaps, for markets. We're hearing from Jerome Powell at Jackson Hole and already from Governor Ueda testifying in two back-to-back sessions in the Japanese parliament. So let's just check in on these markets. We've had some mixed data out of the US. We've had some cautious Fed speak as well. And you did see those hawkish signals sending the two-year yield above 4%. Currently, you're looking at 3.98%. You're looking at futures pointing higher stateside, but a touch weaker in Europe. Does this psychologically important 5,600 level hold, we asked today? You had the dollar strengthening, weighing on the rest of the G10 currencies. Do we see euro-dollar breaking below that 111 level as well today? We'll keep an eye on all of it, but it's also been a big week for US politics. So if we just flip the board, I've got a couple of charts to just show you where we stand at the end of this week. We have had the fantastic coverage out of Chicago, it has to be said, and we have seen, if we flip over to the US politics story next, we have seen Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump in both the polls and the betting markets. And actually, Harris's lead over Donald Trump widening in terms of the poll average. You can see it here. But if we flip the board again, if you look at the betting odds, here you go. They show her that her lead against Donald Trump has actually narrowed, and this is according to Predict It. So, in other words, this is very much an open race, and we'll get more for you from Chicago. But let's check in on how Asia markets are faring. Avril Hong's on standby for us in Singapore with a close eye on the yen. Over to you, Avril.
Absolutely. We're seeing the Japanese currency gaining ground against all its G10 peers. And this is after Ueda spoke in Parliament in defense of his hawkish rate hike late last month. And he indeed seemed to double down on that hawkish messaging, saying that if the economy and the inflation prints kind of support, they're going to continue adjusting monetary policy, signaling the potential for more tightening, more hikes. He even said that the neutral rate, where they are right now, actually, is far below the neutral rate. So we actually saw Japanese stocks pairing gains from earlier in the session, that gain, as I say, on the yen and looking bearish on Japanese bonds as well. Lizzie.
OK, Avril Hong in Singapore, we thank you for the update there. And now let's get back to US politics. Vice President Kamala Harris formally accepting the Democratic presidential nomination in a historic step that kicks off a 3-month dash to Election Day. Harris says helping the middle class will be her focus, while strengthening America's leadership as well on the global stage.
I promise to be a president for all Americans. You can always trust me to put country above party and self, to hold sacred America's fundamental principles, from the rule of law to free and fair elections to the peaceful transfer of power.
Well, Vonnie Quinn joins us now from Washington, D.C. for analysis. Vonnie, you were listening to that whole speech. Your key takeaways?
She definitely concentrated on making the argument to the American public, and not just Democrats, but conservatives alike, Republicans, independents, and all those undecideds out there, that she should be the next president of the United States. And it wasn't just economic opportunities for the middle class that she concentrated on, Lizzie. She also talked about protecting reproductive rights, voting rights, civil rights, and she promised to be strong on border and immigration issues. She definitely gave us some biography that many people wouldn't have heard before, and she came across as that public prosecutor that went to work every morning and said, Kamala Harris for the people. That was her line. She talked a little bit about Donald Trump. It wasn't vitriolic, but she did say that it was important to remember that if Donald Trump were to be elected again, just imagine what would happen if there were no guardrails, and how he would use the immense powers of the presidency of the United States. And she spent a little bit of time as well on national security and foreign issues. She wants to be the next commander-in-chief of the United States, and over the next 75 days, she's going to have to make this case, particularly in swing states, the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt, which are up for grabs, and it's going to be an extraordinarily tight race. To that end, you also saw some Republicans take the stage this week. Just before Kamala Harris, you had Representative Adam Kinzinger talking to conservatives out there, saying, literally, Democrats are as patriotic as we are.
And Ronnie, we also had Harris mentioning Gaza. Is it enough to win back those pro-Palestinian voters who we know were protesting at the convention?
And continued to protest, and those 30 uncommitted delegates continue to be uncommitted. Lizzie, they wanted to see someone of Palestinian extraction on that stage. We did have parents of a hostage on the stage at one point. We'll have to see. There will be a bump in general from the polls. That's what typically happens, at least. And after this convention, it would be difficult to suggest that there wouldn't be a bump. But will what she said be enough? Well, it was a lot more than what Joe Biden has ever said. She talked in the same sentence about Israel and about Palestine. She said what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. And then she repeated that President Biden and herself are working to end the war such that Israel is secure. And then she added this bit, and that Palestinian people can recognize their right to dignity, freedom, security and self-determination. I imagine that those activists and protesters outside the convention centre will have wanted more, but would it be enough to turn the average voter, the average Arab, Muslim and other voter that are pro-Palestinian? We'll have to see. She definitely has some staff on her campaign that are dedicated to the outreach to those voters.
All right, Ronnie Quinn with the top lines out of Chicago. We thank you. And let's get more now from Karl Widerquist, who is a professor at Georgetown University in Qatar. Karl, good to have you with me. You've been watching both parties' conventions. What do you think will be the main battle lines for this election?
It's going to be vision. You've got Donald Trump's very dark vision about being under threat and fears of foreigners, fears of immigrants. Whereas Kamala Harris is going to try to project a feeling of optimism, of working together with our allies, of this theme of not going back, that people have made gains and Trump is trying to take them away, whereas Trump is trying to say our best days are behind us, let's go back there. Kamala Harris is going to project an image of our best days are ahead of us, and we don't become great by going backwards. We become great by going forwards.
Mm. It definitely feels vibes heavy and policy light. I wonder what Harris is actively offering other than not being Joe Biden.
Well, there is a very big possibility that that's enough, because Joe Biden had a lot of very popular policies. He was a popular person, and she automatically, without distancing herself from any of Joe Biden's policies, she automatically distanced herself from his most unpopular aspect, which was that he was the oldest president we've ever had, and that he quite visibly appeared to be slowing. She's not slowing. She wouldn't be anywhere near the oldest president we've ever had. And she brings all this excitement by being a woman of color. All of those things differentiate her from Joe Biden in the eyes of the American people. And all of those things bring excitement in a way that she doesn't necessarily have to be very heavy on the specifics. And people, and there have been a lot of specifics here. A Trump administration would further restrict abortion rights. A Harris administration would do what she can to expand them, to bring back what abortion rights have been taken away over the last several years. We'll under a Trump administration. Oh, sorry, go on.
Well,
so she has done
I just wanted to ask whether you would compare that 2008 excitement to this excitement. That certainly seems what they've been trying to recreate in Chicago this week.
Yes. Obama did a masterful job of running people's excitement about, he was really just a middle of the road Democrat, but by having his background, people projected their ideas of all of their, a wide coalition of people projected their ideas onto him of what they wanted to see, and they didn't need a lot of specifics from him, and he won a very big election that year. Kamala Harris is getting similar enthusiasm on the Democratic side. We're so polarized. She's not likely to ride that to as big a win as Obama did in 2008, but she does have a good chance of riding that enough to win the election.
Well, if we can just turn from the vibes to the policy, do you think that the Democrats have handled the protesters well? Do you think that Kamala Harris should be doing more to distinguish herself from Joe Biden when it comes to foreign policy?
Well, it depends what you mean by well. If you mean by well strategically, that is a very difficult question. What she's trying to do is, there are Democratic voters on both sides of this issue and on all sides of this issue. It's not simple binary of either you support Israel or you support Gaza. There's a big continuum in between of how many restraints you would put on Israel's excessive force. For strategically, she's trying to bridge that gap and get all these people behind her to win the election. In that sense, she might well, because she's worried about, if I do more for the people who are demanding a ceasefire now, will I alienate some other Democratic voters who are stronger supporters of what the Netanyahu government has been doing. And in that sense, that strategy is very hard, and she might have walked that line. However, as far as doing the right thing, that this is excessive force in Gaza, and it's not enough for just Joe Biden to say they have a point, and for her to say, well, eventually Palestinians need self-determination. Is that will she do more to move towards a ceasefire? Well, a ceasefire happened before she was there. For something signaling more of that, they could have brought a Palestinian on stage. They might have got a person of a Palestinian and a person of Jewish heritage together or something like that. They didn't do something like that, which might have been a better signal that she's going to do more for the great suffering that is going on in Gaza.
So perhaps notable for what they didn't do. Karl Widerquist, great to have you with me on the programme. Professor at Georgetown University in Qatar, we thank you for making time. And I just want to get you to the latest here in the Middle East, because we are following the developments this morning with the Israeli negotiators in Cairo for another round of Gaza ceasefire talks. The meeting comes after Secretary of State Antony Blinken returned to Washington from his trip to Israel, Egypt and Qatar, intending to bring the parties closer to agreement. And on the table is a proposal for a phased cessation of hostilities, the release of hostages held by Hamas, and a surge of humanitarian assistance to civilians in Gaza, as well as the withdrawal of Israeli forces from key areas of the enclave. Just checking on Brent, though, we have been looking out for this ceasefire deal for the 2 weeks I've been in Dubai. We've been looking out for an Iranian strike. Still no sign of either. And you've got oil heading for a weekly loss. Brent trading at $77 a barrel on this challenging demand outlook, the sinking product prices, but also the efforts to reach that ceasefire deal in Gaza. But still ahead, the main story in the markets today, waiting for Fed Chair Jerome Powell to speak at Jackson Hole as the central bank remains on the cusp of rate cuts. We'll have analysis next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Now, the Fed Chair Jerome Powell is set to usher in the next chapter in the inflation battle today when he delivers his highly anticipated speech at Jackson Hole. Before that, two Fed officials have already signalled gradual and methodical rate cuts soon. Let's bring in Bloomberg MLive strategist Mary Nicola for a preview. Mary, Powell's really got a difficult needle to thread here. I wonder what tone you're expecting him to strike if he doesn't want to upset the market.
I think actually he'll probably strike a similar tone to some of his colleagues that we've heard of that cautious and methodical way of going into a rate cut. I think he'll disappoint a lot of people who are expecting a big jumbo-sized rate cut, especially in September, because at the end of the day, that the Fed will still need more data, in terms of how the labor market is moving, and especially because we're seeing that the consumer is holding up quite well. So it'll really depend on how we're projecting with the labor market, and then of course inflation. Inflation is showing signs of coming off, but we're still not there yet in terms of reaching that inflation target.
And how bad would a cautious Powell be for the euro?
Yeah, I think in general you could get some upset more broadly in terms of on the currency front because of the fact that there's so much have been priced in. If you take, for example, in some of the rates markets, they're looking for about 30 basis points of cuts, roughly, for September, and then of course there's a lot of more aggressive easing thereafter. So if you're looking at those expectations, and largely what has fueled the rally in the euro, in sterling, has been the expectations of the Fed coming in a lot more dovish. But that's unlikely, and so you're going to likely see that being pulled back and pared back a bit as traders start repricing some of these bets. But of course, it'll be that the Jerome Powell is likely to signal a rate cut, but just not aggressive.
And we've got the yen pairing some of the earlier gains, 145 per dollar where we trade now, but still 0.4% higher. I wonder which of Ueda's comments traders have really been honing in on.
Yeah, I think what the overall message that Ueda gave is the fact that rate hikes are going to proceed, especially if they continue to meet their targets. And so far, it looks like the growth, they're meeting those targets. When we saw the GDP numbers, it was showing signs of reflation in the economy. Their inflation as well is showing signs that inflation is coming back. So there's no reason to really put a pause on what their intentions are and for initiating that continuation of their hiking cycle. So that genie's out of the bag now, and it's out of the bottle. So what they're going to do is probably walk a fine line in terms of ensuring that the market doesn't get as disrupted as last time. So maybe flagging things a little bit more. But of course, what we're seeing now is the trajectory for the yen, and that is for the yen to strengthen because we're going to see more increases and more hikes from the BOJ.
OK, Bloomberg's MLive strategist Mary Nicola, we thank you for that. Of course, we're also going to hear from the Bank of England Governor Andrew Bailey, his first comments since the August rate cut. More cuts expected this year. It'll be interesting to get his comments on the latest jobs and inflation data, so also keep an eye on sterling. But right here on this show, despite crumbling infrastructure and a challenging economic backdrop in South Africa, one of the country's largest banks says the future is exciting. We're going to bring you our exclusive interview with the Capitec CEO next. So stay with us. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Now, the shares in South Africa's Capitec have surged in the last 12 months, becoming the fastest growing bank on the continent. With a market cap of over $18 billion, Capitec is closing in on Africa's largest lender, Standard Bank. And the CEO, Gerrie, Fourie, told us exclusively what's behind its success.
And if you look at, especially in South Africa, the Reserve Bank has done a tremendous job over the years looking after the banks and making certain that we perform according to certain standards. So it's that trust side that you need to look after. But I think what you've seen with us is we are just a retail bank. We've moved very strong in the financial services area, and to make certain that we are competitive and that we create value and stickiness with our client base. So, you know, to give you a certain, as we're selling now on data, we're selling 32% of all data in South Africa. Electricity, we're selling 26% of all electricity in South Africa that people actually just buy through the app. So we've moved away from just being a bank to a fully fledged financial institution.
How do you navigate the operating environment here in South Africa? Because we have seen, to a certain extent, some things ease up, right? You mentioned energy. We've seen load shedding sort of come back. Potentially interest rates will start to come down. But how has the bank been navigating the challenges in the near term?
It's actually quite interesting. If I look at the last 4 years, we had COVID, we had the Russia-Ukraine war, we had the whole, let's call it, world recession, we had load shedding in South Africa. And you can go back and say, okay, it's difficult out there and I'm not going to do anything. Our mentality was completely different. And in our AGM and our full year results, I've mentioned it. Over this period, we invested $6.8 billion in investing in our systems, our processes, our products. And that's what you see now. The growth is coming through. I'm actually excited about South Africa because if I look at the new political arena and the opportunities there, if we can get the private sector going, load shedding looks like under control, interest rates is going to come down. So I think there's opportunities. So it's how do you use those opportunities? I always say you need to be extremely positive and look for opportunities. If you're negative, you won't see anything. So even in South Africa that was struggling, we were looking for opportunities to say how can we satisfy the client's needs.
So that was the Capitec CEO, Gerrie, Fourie, speaking to Bloomberg's Jennifer Sabasaja. And coming up on the programme, our next guest says that the US economy is more important for financial markets than the upcoming elections. We'll bring you that take next with Marie Thibout. This is Bloomberg. This is Horizons Middle East and Africa. Our top stories this morning. US Vice President Kamala Harris takes centre stage at the Democratic convention as she formally accepts the nomination for president, becoming the second woman ever nominated for the presidency by a major US political party. Stocks edge lower and Japan's yen rises as investors brace for a reality check on rate cuts ahead of Jerome Powell's speech at Jackson Hole. And on our next Africa segment this week, the bitter truth. Chocolate prices are likely to stay high as Ghana says it will no longer be borrowing from international banks to fund next season's cocoa crop. It's just gone 8:30 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Good morning. Happy Friday. It is the biggest day of the week potentially for the markets. We've got Jay Powell at Jackson Hole, Governor Ueda already testifying in Parliament, neither of them wanting to be anything but bland, really. They don't want to commit any news. They They don't want to upset these markets, as we saw earlier in the month. But let's look at how the markets are faring currently. You've got futures pointing higher in the US on Wall Street. Does it hold this 5,600 level, the S&P? Psychologically important, of course. Futures pointing lower, though, a touch in Europe. The two-year US Treasury yield steady under 4%. We did see the hawkish signals yesterday actually pushing it higher. We had the caution from a couple of Fed members and a mixed bag of data as well. And then finally, looking at euro dollar, can it hold this 111 level or break below it as we get all of this various central bank speak throughout the day? We'll have full coverage for you. But of course, it's not just the central bank story that's big today. It is also the politics. Let's just flip the board to show you where the week is ending, really, when it comes to the US election. We've had the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. And just look at this, where we have the Real Clear Politics poll average. So Kamala Harris leading Donald Trump in both the polls and the betting markets. Here you can see that actually her lead over Trump is widening in terms of the poll average. But if we flip the board over, look at the betting odds. This is where the story gets interesting, because actually they show that her lead over Donald Trump has narrowed. You can see the red and the blue lines there, the betting market according to Predict It. In other words, this could still continue to be an exciting race. We'll go back to Chicago later, but let's get into the markets in Asia. We talked about the yen. Let's get more with Avril Hong. She's in Singapore for us. What's happening, Avril?
Yeah, we're actually seeing a bit of a reversal from the initial reaction to Ueda sounding less dovish. Indeed, he seemed to cement the view that we're going to get more rate hikes from the Bank of Japan, as he highlighted that they are currently still far below the neutral rate. And stocks in Japan are actually picking up the pace from their session lows earlier, and the yen is also pairing some of the gains from earlier on. I also wanted to highlight, as we look ahead to Jackson Hole, I think that is going to be the focus for the markets, the extent in which we're going to see that easing signal from Powell. In the meantime, Chinese equities getting a bit of a sentiment boost thanks to a Vice Minister for Housing saying they're going to quicken the buying of unsold homes and turning it into affordable housing. Of course, property is at the center of the economic weakness in China. Hang Seng dragged by NetEase. This is no thanks to a revenue miss from the gaming company. But we're seeing Alibaba a bit of a bright spot today after it got its status for the Hong Kong listing. Eventually, it's going to be upgraded to primary. This is a key move before it can participate in the Stock Connect and bring in more inflows to the stock. Lizzie.
Avril Hong, we thank you for the update. You talked about Jackson Hole. I want to bring you a preview now. Jerome Powell potentially going to shed light on the Fed's rate path in a highly anticipated speech from Wyoming later today. The biggest question really is whether the central bank is going to cut at its September meeting and by how much. Bloomberg's Mike McKee has this preview.
All Wall Street wants to know, how far will he go? Investors would love a rate cut pledge from Chairman Powell. That's not likely. He's also unlikely to say how far the Fed will cut or what their next steps will be. Instead, expect acknowledgement that the Fed is close to changing rates as long as the incoming financial data meets forecasts. He still has to get some of his colleagues on board.
This mandate on the inflation side is really important. I think we seem to be getting some really good movement that direction. But before we act, at least before I act or recommend acting, I think we need to see a little bit more.
Kansas City Schmidt can't define how much a little bit might be. But for Wall Street, Powell just raising the subject may be enough. There's also interest in how much he might talk about the Fed's framework review, which the central bank begins to undertake this fall. The transmission of monetary policy is the topic of this year's symposium. Michael McKee, Bloomberg, Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
Well, I, for one, am very disappointed about the lack of cowboy hats in that video. But let's get more analysis now with Marie Thibout, Senior Economist and Strategist at Mirabaud Asset Management. Good morning from Geneva. I wonder who you're more excited about today, Marie, Governor Ueda or Chair Powell. But let's start in Wyoming. We had those dovish Fed minutes on Wednesday. Do you expect Powell to be dovish today?
Yeah, obviously, market will expect indication regarding the pace of rate cut, the timing of the rate cut, and also the extent of the rate cut. Of course, Mr. Powell won't likely pre-commit to anything because the Fed, is data dependent. What he could say regarding the timing is that the Fed is very close or close to cut rate because the Fed will learn during the minute that the Fed is more comfortable with inflationary trend now and a little bit more concerned about the pace of the labor market. So that's the first element on the timing. On the pace of the rate cut, no pre-commitment. And regarding the extent, 25 basis point cut remain the more likely announcement because a 50 basis point cut doesn't seem really needed now by the economy. If you look at the latest data, it confirms that we are in a soft landing economy and without any trace for the moment of any hard landing. So that's a major element, you could say.
So where you have this divergence between stocks and bonds kind of closing recently, bonds coming around to stocks optimism, would you say that's warranted then?
Yeah, I mean, now we learned that markets react as bad news is bad news and good news is good news, and that explains also this divergence.
Indeed, finally, we start to see that simplification of the market and economic story. Just turning to Japan, Marie, what do you make of Ueda's comments in Parliament so far? Can there be any doubt that hikes are coming?
Yeah, of course. We've seen after the market sell-off, investors were not prepared to this rate cut, despite the fact that the BOJ has already exited a negative policy rate. What Ueda now is saying is that normalization is coming. Of course, we see inflation is more in line with what the BOJ expects. The BOJ now, the question is the communication of the BOJ and also the normalization pace. It's going to be very moderate and not brutal because they won't want to see any brutal, substantial increase in the yen, of course. But normalization is coming.
OK, coming, but when? When do you see the next rate hike?
Likely by the end of the year or by the beginning of next year. And then we could wait another 5 or 6 months because remember, they exited the negative interest rate policy 5 months ago, and then they announced an increase in interest rate 5 months after. So it's going to be more moderate by the end of the year or in the beginning of next year, yeah, more likely.
And do you expect much change of policy given the Prime Minister Kishida has announced he's not going to run for re-election? Should the market be worried?
To be honest, it's not likely there will be any discontinuity in the policy. There is a growing consensus among the LDP members that the BOJ have to normalize progressively, as I said. So to be honest, not likely, no discontinuity.
All right, Marie Thibout, Senior Economist and Strategist at Mirabaud Asset Management. Good to have you with me on the programme. We thank you. Now, the BOJ is the subject of today's weekly documentary, The Rate Hike Decision Blowing Up a Yen-Centred Carry Trade. How could we forget? But as the dust settles, investors and Japanese business owners alike are questioning the currency's role in the global economy.
A single summertime decision by Japan's central bank ended up triggering a panic. And at the heart of all this, the Japanese yen and a massive global unwinding of the so-called carry trade. So what are carry trades, and why are they contributing to volatility in financial markets? In short, they're a popular strategy of borrowing currency at a very low rate of interest, the yen in this case, and investing it in something that pays you a higher rate. Now, you might make a return from that trade because it's kind of like investing free money. But
if things go incredibly wrong, you'll lose money both on the stock side and then you have to pay back your credit company as well.
Which is exactly what happened in August.
And it all culminated in the Great Unwind, as we call it today. The yen, which everyone had been selling to fund this carry trade, surged in value. All of a sudden, at the same time, people started selling everything that they had in order to cover those margin calls. They had to pay for their losses somehow.
So what we've seen during this market crash basically is that what Japan does, what the Bank of Japan does, can have major implications for the rest of the world.
And subscribers can see that report in full on the terminal or at Bloomberg.com. It'll also be on the Bloomberg Originals YouTube channel later, so do give it a watch. But coming up right here, the bitter truth. Chocolate prices are likely to stay high as Ghana says it'll no longer be borrowing from international banks to fund next season's cocoa crop. We'll have the latest in our next Africa segment. Stay with us, this is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burdett in Dubai. It's 8:44 a.m. here, and after 32 years, Ghana is no longer borrowing from international banks to fund next season's cocoa crop. The nation has previously relied on local loan proceeds, to shore up the currency. Economist and professor at the University of Ghana Business School, Godfred Bokpin, though, told us overall this is not good news.
I think overall it's not good news for Ghana. Because cocoa has been one of our major exports, and it provides stability for the local currency in terms of shoring up our international reserves. The decline in the cocoa production and the fact that in the last 3 or 4 years, Cocoa Board has arrears in terms of cocoa supply to our creditors clearly doesn't signal a good future for us as a country. And I believe that as part of the reforms and resetting, we need to pay particular attention to agriculture, agribusiness, and of course, diversifying the economy also implies that we add value to some of our primary commodities. But for now, cocoa seems to be giving away what we have relied on in the last couple, or since independence, let me put it that way.
So then, Godfred, I mean, does that mean we see the local currency potentially then weaken and inflation start to rise again? Because as you were just mentioning there, we have seen this decision for the past few decades helping to stabilize the local currency. What do you think then is sort of next to come?
Yeah, so far, even though we've seen relative stability with the IMF-supported program, we still think that there's a lot that has to be done in ensuring that macro level development translates to household and private sector level. And that is where we are now. But of course, with the restructuring of our domestic debt and also the external debt, both external commercial and external bilateral, there's been some kind of a relief for the country, at least until 2026. But sustainably, you will see headwinds, you will see risk that has to be managed in terms of whether the cedi will continue to be stable for the foreseeable future. That's a big issue that the country has to deal with.
So that was Godfred Bokpin, economist and professor at the University of Ghana Business School. And for more on my favourite subject, chocolate, Bloomberg's chief Africa correspondent Jennifer Sabasaja joins me now. She brought us that interview. Jen, I wonder what you made of those comments there. Do you think that this change is economically viable for Ghana?
You know, Lizzie, I also do like talking about chocolate, for that matter. Listen, but in this sense, it was fascinating hearing from Godfred, because he really didn't mince words about just how necessary this is. And so, you know, you just heard him saying there that this is not good news, but he did tell me that he was expecting this to happen because of the balance sheet of the cocoa board, because of the lack of production levels that we've really seen the cocoa industry in Ghana being able to live up to. And so so, yes, this is a reset. And in his words, this isn't just limited to the cocoa sector in Ghana. He believes that this is going to soon reveal a lot of the cracks in the economy more broadly, and thinks that this needs to happen. And potentially this is going to cause more pain for the cocoa industry in Ghana, but also potentially for Ghanaians that are already dealing with inflation that is north of 20%. And so he does believe that this is the right decision, but he does not believe that this should be the only point and decision really that needs to be made about agriculture, because there is a lot of issues that he thinks the government has really sort of sat back on over the past few years, because agriculture should really put Ghana in a position of economic strength, and it's not at this point.
OK, so that's the broader Ghana economic position. But what are his expectations, Jen, for the cocoa price more specifically?
Well, you know, Godfred he thinks that prices will potentially go up, but because we have seen targets actually in Ghana reduced for the 2024-2025 harvest, he doesn't believe that whether or not we see prices increase or not, Ghana is going to optimally benefit from it. That is his exact words that he said. And so, again, he thinks that there is an opportunity here for the industry to reset and eventually be able to be in a position of strength when it comes to seeing these prices really trickling back into the economy. And he did actually speak to, and I think we sometimes forget about the fact that even when we see these prices go up, it's not always translating to the farmers that are actually on the ground and doing the harvesting. And so he thinks, you know, we have elections in Ghana coming up in December, and potentially if we do see prices continue to go up, if we see some of these candidates follow through on their promises to revive the agriculture industry, then regardless if the prices are up or down, Ghanaians and the second biggest producer of cocoa in the world, this country, will be able to actually benefit. So it was a really fascinating discussion with him.
Yeah, political story too. Jennifer Sabasaja, we thank you for that crucial context. And you can find more on this story and what's happening across the continent in our next Africa newsletter and podcast. Subscribe at Bloomberg.com and wherever you listen to your podcasts for that. But coming up on this programme, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi is making his first visit to Kyiv since the Russian invasion in 2022. We'll get you more on what he's looking to achieve next. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Lizzie Burden in Dubai. Now to the geopolitics, where the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has reinforced his message that the war in Ukraine can only be resolved diplomatically. That's ahead of his first visit to Kyiv since Russia's invasion in 2022. And we can get more now from our Bloomberg government reporter, Sudhi Ranjan Sen, who joins us from New Delhi. Sudhi, I do wonder, why is Modi visiting Ukraine now?
Well, I mean, clearly it is a move from India and from Modi to balance relationship. We've seen Prime Minister Modi visiting Russia soon after he was elected at heading a coalition government in June. He headed off to Russia. That caused a lot of concern, frustration within the Biden administration. Mind you, India is looking out for better and stronger relationship with the United States. And that visit did cause a lot of concern to the extent we saw, and as my colleagues and I have reported, calls made to the highest levels in India from the United States, asking why, asking about the visit and why at that point of time and what Prime Minister Modi was trying to signal. So clearly this visit is about balancing. Although the Ministry of External Affairs kind of says or has said that the relationship between Ukraine and Russia are separate and it's not a zero-sum game, and also the fact that this visit has been in the planning for some time. But nonetheless, the obvious connect cannot be overlooked. It is a move to clearly balance ties.
OK, so showing that he's not just on Russia's side, trying to appease the US, but is there more that he's hoping to achieve here?
Yes, I mean, if you look at Prime Minister Modi's foreign policy and over the last 10 decades, it's more transactional than what India's foreign policy used to be earlier. And why I say this is because Prime Minister Modi, with this visit to Poland and now to Ukraine, is trying to widen up India's reach, widen India's reach in Central Europe. Traditionally, India's foreign policy vis-a-vis Europe was more centered around the United Kingdom, Germany, France. Central Europe really didn't figure well. Now, with the possible rebalance coming within Europe itself because of this of Russia's invasion in Ukraine, Prime Minister Modi is looking out for opportunities to kind of develop ties with Central Europe, develop commercial relations with Central Europe. So that is also another fallout or byproduct of this visit.
OK, Sudhi Ranjan Sen, who'll be across that visit for us. Potentially lots of commercial and business deals on the table as well. We thank you for joining us, Sudhi, from New Delhi. As we wrap up the show, we're looking at US futures pointing higher as we look towards Jackson Hole, Jay Powell's speech later. But Eurostoxx 50 futures lower 0.1% currently. But that is all we've got time for. It's been a pleasure hosting you on Horizons Middle East and Africa these past 2 weeks. Thank you so much to the team here in Dubai. Up next, Daybreak Europe. You'll be with me for another hour as we get closer to the cash trade. Plenty more on Jackson Hole, US politics and the yen. So do stay with us. This is Bloomberg.